After closing the front door behind him, John sighed in relief. His wife and daughter had left for his mother-in-law's place in the countryside, and he could finally indulge in the pleasures of bachelor life that he had longed for over many months. The beautiful summer day outside made him even happier. The heat was unbearable, so the first thing John did was open all the windows in the apartment. He thought again about how nice it would be to have an air conditioner, but unfortunately, he should have prepared for that earlier. It was July, and the waiting list for installations stretched all the way to September. It'll be fine, he thought, grabbing a bottle of beer from the fridge. Half a week had passed. John was enjoying his unrestrained solitude. It reminded him of his youth, going to clubs, hanging out with questionable friends, and having casual flings with equally questionable girls. He tried not to think too much about the girls, though. Over his 43 years and a decade of marriage, a lot had happened, but there was one unpleasant incident he tried to push far from his mind. Once, after a big fight with his wife, he ended up at a bar and met an attractive girl. They partied all night, and he woke up at her place across town. Realizing what he'd done, he hurried to leave and rushed home with a pounding headache. He begged his wife for forgiveness for a month, but never mentioned the fling, although she seemed to suspect something. Gradually, it all started to fade, until one day he received a text saying his former fling needed money for an abortion. He met her, gave her the money, and they agreed never to contact each other again. But for almost a year afterward, he couldn't sleep, expecting her to show up at his door with a baby. He couldn't eat or sleep, but with each passing year, he thought about it less and less, pushing the memory away whenever it surfaced. John had lost track of how many days he'd spent in his bachelor rhythm. He went to work just to keep his job, barely functioning due to his nightly drinking and morning hangovers. The hangovers got worse each day, making his life miserable. The urge to drink was becoming overwhelming. He'd chat with his wife occasionally, hiding his daily drinking and trying to sound pleasant. One day, about a week after his family left, John looked at himself in the bathroom mirror more closely than usual. He saw a gray, lifeless face with puffy eyes and decided, "I'm quitting drinking." On the first day of his forced sobriety, John could barely get out of bed. He reached for a glass of water he'd prepared earlier, but it didn't help. He had to get ready for work. He'd fallen behind on many tasks over the past few days. John was determined not to touch a bottle today. Gotta be careful, or it could be the end of me, he thought, finishing his second cigarette on the balcony. A sharp pain in his chest made him worry briefly, but it passed quickly. Uh-oh, he thought. Could it be my heart? The feeling passed, but the unease lingered. John slowly made his way to the bathroom, holding onto the wall. As soon as he got there, his vision blurred, and he barely made it to the toilet before vomiting. He vomited for what felt like an eternity, even though his stomach was empty and he was just bringing up water. After about 20 minutes, it finally stopped. He slid down the bathroom wall, panting heavily. He looked a bit better than he had the night before, splashed some water on his face, and hurried to work. He barely made it through the endless workday and dragged himself home. His route took him past the liquor store he visited daily, but he forced himself to walk by without going in. The heat wave had lasted for 3 weeks, and the weather seemed to taunt him, suggesting he buy a cold beer. He rushed past the store and into his apartment building. Seeing his neighbor with a baby in a stroller approaching the entrance, he quickly slipped into the open elevator and frantically pressed the close button. He didn't like his neighbors and had no patience for other people's kids. The door closed, and he sighed in relief. Just before the elevator moved, he heard the baby crying. The sound echoed through the elevator shaft, pounding in his throbbing head, and faded around the 3rd or 4th floor. The crying was so loud it sounded like the baby was climbing up the shaft after him. "Why do people have so many kids?" he muttered to himself. He imagined a baby climbing up the elevator cable, screaming, and let out a nervous laugh. The elevator finally reached the 12th floor, and he stepped out. After closing the door behind him, he sighed in relief. Another day was over. Now he just needed to cook something simple for dinner, not just simple mac and cheese with hot dogs. Then he could forget everything and get some proper sleep for the first time in weeks without alcohol. As he filled a pot with water, he suddenly froze. An unfamiliar sensation washed over him, one he hadn't felt in a long time. He stood still, listening to his body. Inside his chest, it felt like a small bird was fluttering, trying to find a way out. His legs felt weak, and his breath came in short gasps. His head was pounding, and all he could do was focus on his body. Suddenly, he realized what this feeling was: an overwhelming, all-consuming anxiety. The sensation jolted him out of his stupor as water spilled over his hands from the pot. He set the pot down and sat on a chair, but he couldn't stay seated for long. The anxiety was growing, so he rushed to the balcony, opened the door, and sat down to catch his breath in the fresh air. The calmness he sought didn't come, so he rushed back to the kitchen, drank a glass of cold water, and splashed some on his face in the bathroom. He felt a little better. As he left the bathroom, he caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but only saw a fleeting shadow sliding down the window. Must be my imagination, he thought, his body drenched in sweat from fear. Yeah, just my imagination. He rushed to the window, threw it open, and even leaned out to look down. Kids were playing on the playground below, and adults were returning from work. Everything seemed normal. Trying to calm himself, he went to the bathroom to splash more cold water on his face. As he lifted his head, he thought he saw a young woman holding a bundle in her arms in the mirror's reflection. He jumped back in shock and turned around quickly, but it was just the shower curtain bunched up in a strange way. His heart was still racing, and he made his way back to the bedroom on shaky legs, constantly looking over his shoulder for any sign of an intruder. The haunting image wouldn't leave his mind. Finally, he made it to the bed and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. He must have dozed off because he woke up with a start, thinking he heard someone call his name loudly in his ear. His bed was soaked in sweat and he was shivering slightly. He managed to stand and stumbled to the kitchen cabinet where they kept the first aid kit. He took 2 sedatives, swallowing them with a glass of water, and put the pot back on the counter. He returned to the bedroom and lay down again, but sleep still wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, vague images floated through his mind. He drifted off for a moment and had a vivid dream. A woman was standing in his bedroom holding a bundle. He couldn't see her face clearly, but he could feel her staring at him. The bundle began to squirm, and a fleshy tendril emerged, growing longer and longer. John was frozen in terror, unable to move. The tendril reached his feet, and a muffled baby's cry came from the bundle. John jolted awake and fell out of bed. He looked around the room, but it was empty and silent, except for the faint sound of a baby crying next door. He realized he was drenched in sweat and struggling to breathe. The room felt stuffy and hot, so he opened the window wide and decided to take a shower. As he made his way to the bathroom, he kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see something. The nightmare image was still fresh in his mind. Finally, he stepped into the shower, and the cool water helped him relax a little. As he stood under the stream, he couldn't stop thinking. His thoughts were jumbled, but one stuck in his mind. He suddenly remembered his past mistake. Was her name Lisa? He thought, the voice in his head sounding unfamiliar. You never confessed. What if you have a child out there? What child? He dismissed the thought. It was just a one-night stand. I barely remember anything. He realized he was arguing with himself and felt a pang of anxiety. Okay, I'm really quitting drinking this time. I must be going crazy, he thought. He stayed in the shower for a few more minutes, feeling a bit calmer. The oppressive feeling lingered, but he felt exhausted and dried himself off with a towel before returning to bed. As soon as his head hit the pillow, he fell asleep instantly. Sleep still wouldn't come after 2 nights, and John was a wreck from nerves and exhaustion. He tried to sleep, but it was fitful, filled with vivid and brief nightmares. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. A growing sense of unease was becoming unbearable. He tossed and turned in his sweat-soaked bed, occasionally glancing at the clock. It was well past midnight. but sleep still wouldn't come. Suddenly, the phone in the living room rang, making him jump. "What the?" he muttered. He got out of bed slowly, put on his slippers, and shuffled toward the phone. The cold moonlight filled the apartment with an eerie calm, but John felt uneasy. He picked up the phone and said, "Hello?" in a tired voice. "Why didn't you call me?" a distant cold voice asked. "Who is this?" John asked, genuinely confused about who would call so late. "I was waiting for you, hoping you'd call." The woman on the other end continued as if she hadn't heard his question. "Who is this?" he asked again, more annoyed this time. "But it's too late now," she said, and the line went dead. "So many crazy people out there," he muttered, pulling the phone cord out of the wall. As he walked past his daughter's room, he thought he saw a tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the moonlit room. He froze, his heart pounding, and pressed himself against the wall. What was that? He thought, not believing his eyes. He stood there, barely breathing, but heard no sound from the room. Summoning his courage, he peeked around the door frame, but the room was empty. He felt like an idiot, standing there in the dark, staring at an empty room. He let out a nervous laugh and turned toward his bedroom, but froze again when the phone rang. He hesitated, then decided to answer it and give the caller a piece of his mind. But as he looked down, he saw the phone cord still lying on the floor, disconnected. The phone kept ringing, and his heart raced as he picked it up. "Hello, who is this?" he shouted into the receiver. "You can't hide anymore," the now familiar voice said. John realized the voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "I've been looking for you for a long time," the woman said in the same distant voice. "I wanted to tell you I'm gone now, and I'm with our baby." He suddenly realized whose voice it was. "Lisa?" he almost shouted into the phone. It was her, the woman he tried not to think about, the one he felt guilty about, the one who made it hard for him to look his wife in the eye. He stood there, holding the phone, trying to figure out how she got his number. As he moved, his foot caught on the phone cord, reminding him that the phone shouldn't even be working. "We'll be coming to visit you soon, so get ready," she said, followed by an eerie giggle. The laughter grew louder, and John stood frozen in the hallway, too terrified to move. The laughter was mixed with the sound of a baby crying, and he couldn't hang up the phone. Finally, the noise stopped, and he dropped the receiver. He rushed back to the bedroom, locked the door, and slid down the wall onto the soft carpet. Questions raced through his mind. How did she get his number? Why was she calling? How was this even possible? He felt a wave of fear wash over him, his limbs going numb and his breath coming in short gasps. He felt terrible, and the pain in his chest was growing. He sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down, when he heard a noise from the kitchen. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. A rotting smell filled the air, like spoiled chicken. Something heavy and foul-smelling was moving toward the bedroom. "Ju-un," a soft whisper came from the hallway. "You can't hide, I'll find you." John panicked, his heart racing as he looked around the room for a place to hide. Under the bed, he thought, but then he imagined something horrible dragging him out from under the bed, and he changed his mind. The closet, he thought, rushing over and climbing inside. He hid among the hanging clothes and left the door open a crack so he could see. The bedroom door creaked open slowly, and a grotesque figure stepped into the room. It barely resembled the woman he once knew. Its skin was smooth and gray in the dim light, and it was naked, its belly and limbs swollen and distorted. It moved slowly, its joints creaking and popping with each step. It approached the bed, and John was glad he hadn't hidden there. "Johnny, baby, where are you?" it called out in a mocking sing-song voice. "I can feel you. I'm getting closer." The creature bent backward at an impossible angle, its spine cracking loudly. John felt dizzy and disoriented, his vision swimming. He could barely think straight, his mind racing with fear. The stench of decay filled the room, making it hard to breathe. The creature bent over backward, its head twisting around to face the ceiling. Its skin split in places. oozing black fluid as it reached out one arm to lift the bedsheet. John knew he had to run, but he was frozen in terror. He watched as the creature peered under the bed, its body contorted in a grotesque bridge pose. He tried to shift his position quietly, but he bumped into a hanger, making a soft clattering sound. The creature's head snapped up, and it began to move toward the closet, its eyes fixed on John. He tumbled out of the closet, crawling on his hands and knees toward the hallway. The creature followed, its body still bent at an impossible angle, moving with a slow but deliberate gait. John scrambled to his feet and lunged for the door, but when he looked out, he saw only a vast, empty darkness where the hallway should have been. He felt a wave of dizziness and fell backward, the creature looming over him. He tried to crawl away, but it grabbed him with its cold, bony hands, pulling him back into the bedroom. He struggled and kicked, but it was too strong. It dragged him toward the open window, and he could see the night sky outside. "No, please don't," he begged, but the creature just laughed, a harsh and mocking sound. It lifted him up and shoved him out the window, and he fell through the empty air, the wind rushing past him. He could see the lights of the city spread out below him, but he was falling too fast to make out any details. The ground rushed up to meet him, and he braced himself for the impact. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of his lungs. He lay there for a moment, stunned, before he realized he was still in the hallway. He scrambled to his feet and ran to the front door, fumbling with the locks until he finally got it open. He rushed out into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. He sat on the floor, his back against the door, panting and trembling. He could hear the creature scratching at the door, its nails clicking against the wood. It was singing a soft, eerie lullaby, and John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he had to get out of there, so he stood up and ran toward the stairs. As he passed the elevator, he heard it ding and the door slide open. He turned to look and saw a massive, grotesque creature filling the elevator car. It looked like a human embryo, with thin, spindly limbs and milky white eyes. Behind it, writhing and twisting, were dozens of slimy tentacles. "Daddy," it said in a chorus of eerie, childlike voices. John froze in terror as the tentacles reached out and wrapped around him, pulling him into the elevator. The door slid shut, and everything went dark. The morning had not gone well for the emergency medical team. They had to carry the body of a large man out of the elevator of an apartment building themselves. The driver of the ambulance was smoking a cigarette nearby, and as the body was wheeled past, he asked the paramedics about the cause of death. "He had a stroke," one of them replied flatly as the body was loaded into the ambulance. The newly widowed woman and her daughter stepped into the apartment. The place was a mess. Items from the hallway table were scattered everywhere. Clothes from the bedroom closet were strewn about. The bed sheets were rumpled and stained with greasy smudges, and a trail of the same greasy substance led from the bedroom to the kitchen window. The woman was in shock, her mind racing with 1,000 questions that would never be answered. How could this happen? What would she do now? How would she tell her daughter? She barely remembered putting her daughter to bed in a daze before collapsing on the bed herself, sobbing. She sat there in the dark, her mind a whirl of grief and uncertainty, until the ringing of the phone in the hallway jarred her back to reality. She stood up, her heart pounding, and walked toward the phone. The cord was still lying on the floor, disconnected, but the phone was ringing. She picked it up, her hand trembling, and held it to her ear. "Hello?" she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, only the faint sound of static on the other end. She hung up the phone and stood there in the dark, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She knew she had to be strong for her daughter, but she didn't know how she would ever find the strength to go on.